Well, hello. My name is Lord Hardthrasher, country gent and history enjoyer. I make videos on aviation, World War II and the Cold War, and some of them are quite long. This one, however, is not. See, much as I love history, I know that it isn't everybody's cup of tea, and the Second World War in particular can be dauntingly complicated if you only have a passing interest. However, sometimes you just have to know these things, whether it's because you're off on a hot date or need to hold your own with a competitive sibling, or because the boss keeps wittering about it. And this is where this video comes in. The entire war in 20 minutes or less. Jenkins, start the clock. The Second World War started because of ideas and tensions that took years to burst into flame, and also because countries with broken democracies can be very bloody dangerous. In the Far East, the Japanese had convinced themselves that what everybody in Asia really wanted was to throw off the shackles of Western colonialism and come together under Japan's leadership in the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, which just trips off the tongue. Sounds awesome until you realize that this was in fact code for swapping existing colonial masters for new Japanese ones. Japanese democracy had collapsed and the military had essentially grabbed rule of the country, promoting the idea that the Japanese were the greatest people on earth, superior to all other races and the rightful rulers of vast new territories. To that end, Japan had invaded Manchuria in China in 1931 and then had a pop at the rest of China from 1937, killing vast numbers of civilians in the process, including somewhere around 250,000 people in just 6 weeks when they captured the Chinese city of Nanjing. This pretty much aligned the entire world against them, especially the United States, who cut off their oil supply, an oil supply without which Japan could not function. In deep debt due to the massive military spending and now bogged down in a war that they couldn't win, and with national honour on the line, they began to plot for war with the Western powers. Meanwhile, one Adolf Hitler, who you may have heard of, had seized power in Germany, banning all opposition parties and setting about creating his own new empire, the Third Reich. He too had convinced his people that they were the greatest race on earth, destined to rule, if not the world, then certainly large chunks of it. The only thing stopping them, in his eyes, were the Jews and the degenerates of the German society. In fact, all the bad things, like economic crises of the 1920s, losing the First World War and so on, could be blamed on the Jews. What was needed was more space, more Germans, more slaves, and no Jews. As a result, this former corporal and failed painter began to grab territory with monotonous regularity, making Germany bigger and bigger until in 1938 he demanded the Czechoslovakians hand over a strip of land called the Sudetenland, claiming that it contained a lot of German speakers. Which it did, but it also contained most of their industry and all of their defences. Although the French had a huge army and the British had a huge navy, neither country was really ready to fight again. World War I had cost them 2.3 million dead, and the 1930s had been economically disastrous, and there had simply been no political will to rearm and prepare for war. And now here was Germany making unreasonable demands, backed up by what appeared to be a huge army and air force right in the heart of Europe. The British and the French backed down, handing the Sudetenland to Germany without even bothering to ask the Czechs what they thought, all in exchange for peace. This at the time was known as appeasement, and given we're only a few minutes into this video, you can guess how well it went. Less than 6 months later, German troops simply took the rest of Czechoslovakia without a shot being fired. And suddenly even the sleepiest Western politician realised that this Hitler bloke might not be a terribly nice man. I mean, he'd written a book called Mein Kampf in the 1920s outlining his programme of hatred, but still, somehow, they were shocked. In desperation, the West tried to reach out to Joseph Stalin, leader of the USSR, but that failed as Hitler outmanoeuvred them again and signed a non-aggression pact with Uncle Joe in August of 1939. On the 1st of September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, despite warnings from the British and the French that if he did so, they'd start a war. Suddenly, not just the British and the French, but of course all of the countries around the globe that owed allegiance to London or Paris were at war with the Nazis, and so the Second World War began. Meanwhile, the Soviets invaded Poland from the other side, from the east, on the 17th of September, causing it to collapse. It was all over by the 6th of October. Over the next year or so, the Soviets occupied Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and parts of Romania, and even fought a war to try and annex Finland. Things now went to shit for Britain and France. The smart move, whilst Germany was distracted in the east, would have been to use their superior forces and numbers to strike deep into Germany quickly, but inertia, political instability, indecision, and pathetically bad civil and military leadership led to a period called the Phony War, where nothing appeared to be happening at all. A brief foray into Norway was considered, then executed, but on the 10th of May 1940, German forces rolled through the Low Countries and crashed into France in a series of lightning-fast strikes which became known as Blitzkrieg and took the Allies wholly by surprise. In just 6 weeks of one-sided fighting, France was defeated. The British government collapsed and Winston Churchill became Prime Minister, even as the British Army was trying to escape from France through a tiny port called Dunkirk. Thanks to heroic efforts by the Royal Navy and ordinary people sailing their private boats over to France, the army was brought out, but it lost all of its heavy equipment in the process. Hitler assumed that the British would now surrender, but in fact they refused, so the Luftwaffe launched an air campaign designed to destroy the RAF and make the British believe that an invasion across the Channel was possible. Over that summer, a giant air battle broke out over southeast England, known as the Battle of Britain, which saw the Luftwaffe decisively defeated and forced to switch instead to night bombing in an attempt to break British morale. This campaign, known as the Blitz, lasted 8 months and made 1 million Brits homeless and killed upwards of 40,000 men, women and children. But British morale held. The British took this bombing of their cities somewhat personally, but fortunately before the war they developed their own strategic bombing capability in the RAF. Now that they were no longer able to fight the main German forces directly, they turned to bombing German factories and the homes of their workers. At first, this didn't amount to much, but as the war progressed, what had been small-scale and insignificant grew to furious intensity. As Arthur Harris put it, they sowed the seeds and now they reaped the whirlwind. In all, the RAF dropped 955,000 tons of bombs on the Reich, killing or wounding roughly 1 million Germans and making 7.5 million of them homeless, damaging in the process about 80% of all German housing stock. Meanwhile, the United States and the Roosevelt administration had been watching all of this with a mixture of alarm and concern, but they were unwilling at this point to get involved. Most people in the US saw all of this as a bit of a European problem, not an American one. The British, of course, started to place huge orders for equipment, but pretty soon they ran completely out of cash to pay for it, so the United States developed a program called Lend-Lease to supply equipment on a kind of buy-now, pay-later basis. This wasn't wholly altruistic, as it neatly ensured that the United Kingdom would be flat broke and in deep debt when the war ended, clearing the way for America to dominate international trade from then on. All the material that the UK purchased needed to be supplied via the Atlantic shipping lanes, and the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, knew it. To that end, the Germans dispatched every U-boat that it could muster to cut off US supplies into the UK. It failed spectacularly, and on average, during the whole war, something like 75% of their crews were killed, and Allied shipping grew from 18 million tons in 1939 to over 40 million tons by the time that the U-boats had to surrender the Atlantic in May of 1943. Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator, saw which way the wind was blowing and decided to side with Germany just before France fell. Italy was, in reality, not that much of an ally for Hitler. It was economically and morally bankrupt. Although it did have a large navy, its air force and its army were something of a joke. Nonetheless, to prove what a hard man he was, Benito ordered his 150,000-strong army in North Africa to attack the 36,000-strong British forces in Egypt. This promptly went completely sideways for the Italians, who were pushed back hundreds of miles, losing most of their army in the process. Hitler was forced in February of 1941 to send an army of his own to North Africa under one Erwin Rommel, what became known as the Afrika Korps. These pushed back the British quite effectively to the borders of Egypt before they were defeated at the Battle of Alamein in 1942. Meanwhile, in Europe, Hitler and Stalin were, despite their non-aggression pact, both planning to fight at some point. Both massively built up forces on their borders through 1940 and early 1941. However, Britain's refusal to surrender brought things to a head a little faster than Hitler had planned. Or, more accurately, it brought things into Hitler's head that he'd had for some time. His logic, and I will use that term incredibly loosely, was that Britain wouldn't surrender until the Nazis defeated the last possible ally in Europe, the USSR. Who, of course, he was supposed to be friends with, at least on paper. This ignored the British Empire, the United States, and the tiny problem that attacking Stalin would immediately hand Britain a gigantic new ally and cause Germany to have to fight a two-front war. So, why do it? Well, we need to go inside the Nazi mind. Do bring a torch. The Russian Revolution had, according to Nazi logic, been carried out by Jews, who supposedly ran the Soviet Union. Thus, all Jews were Bolsheviks, and all Bolsheviks were Jews. At the same time, Jews supposedly controlled both Britain and America through high finance. Destroy the Judeo-Bolsheviks in the East, and the Judeo-Capitalists in the West would give up. Quite why, I've no idea, but again, the word Nazi and the word logic are essentially mutually exclusive in any sentence. Invading the Soviet Union was always an idea in Hitler's mind, but now it crystallized into action. On the 18th of December 1940, Hitler issued Führer Directive 21, formally ordering the planning to begin, with a view to launching an attack in May 1941. Except there was a problem. In October of 1940, Benito Mussolini had decided to try his own blitzkrieg into Greece. Somewhat predictably, this had gone sideways fast and resulted in 90,000 casualties and Italian forces being driven back into Albania. If this wasn't bad enough, then a pro-Allied coup in Yugoslavia meant suddenly Hitler's southern flank was completely exposed. So instead of concentrating all of his forces on preparing for the invasion of the USSR, he was forced to invade both countries simultaneously. This delayed Hitler's plans for over a month, tied down hundreds of thousands of troops and degraded the Wehrmacht's already poor transport and logistics, and unleashed a wave of sectarian violence which killed upwards of 700,000 civilians, mostly Serbs, not to mention fomenting widespread resistance in the region. Finally, in 1941, the Nazis launched the largest invasion that the world has ever seen, Operation Barbarossa. Thousands of tanks, trucks and aircraft surged across the Soviet border, some 3.8 million men in all, along a front that was over 1,800 miles long. It pushed deep into Soviet territory, but the Soviet Union did not collapse, as Hitler and his general staff had assumed, but instead carried on fighting despite losing 4.5 million men in the process. This was the military clash of the Second World War. 75% of all German military deaths happened fighting the Soviets. Immediately upon hearing about the invasion, both the UK and the USA began to deploy their not inconsiderable industrial strength to help the Soviets and provide them with vast quantities of kit, and they continued to do so for the rest of the war. As an example, something like 50% of all ammunition that Soviet forces used was created by the Allies or used propellant sent by them. This aid was critical to the USSR's survival. Slowly, painfully and bloodily, the combination of Western industrial might and Soviet military might began to drive the Nazis back. From the end of 1942, the Soviets won a series of staggering victories, firstly at Stalingrad and then on until, by April 1945, they arrived at the very gates of Berlin. But we're skipping ahead a bit. Now you might be asking, since we started all of this with the Japanese, where the hell are they and when does the US get involved? Both good questions, and the answer to both of them is the 7th of December 1941. The Japanese, as we noted earlier, had got themselves in quite a bind. They controlled the Chinese coastline, but after years of fighting it was apparent that they could not actually invade the whole of China and hold it, at least not so long as the US embargo went on, and indeed so long as the US continued to supply Chinese forces via the British colony of Burma. They therefore came up with a truly batshit plan. Simultaneously attack the United States in port, invade the Philippines and a dozen other places all at once, sit back and profit. The hope was, a bit like hitting a naughty spaniel across the nose with a rolled-up newspaper, the US would be so stunned that it would give up and accept the New World Order. And this bonkers plan kicked off with an attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941. It came as something of a nasty shock to the Japanese that the US did not, in fact, roll over and instead immediately declared war. Still, the Japanese consoled themselves with massive territorial gains, capturing Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaya, Burma and the Dutch East Indies, all in short order, and of course defeating an American force at Bataan in the Philippines. Thousands and thousands of Allied prisoners of war were dragged off into captivity, where perhaps 70% of them died of disease, starvation and unimaginable cruelty. Of course, in theory, Hitler could have ignored all of this. Yes, there was a treaty between Japan, Germany, and indeed Italy, the so-called Axis Powers Pact, but it didn't require Germany to actually get stuck in just because the Japanese had been mad enough to attack the US. But with German U-boats already being sunk in the Atlantic by US ships protecting convoys, with the US already shipping and supplying the USSR and the UK with vast quantities of stuff, in his tiny little mind he was already at war with them, so this formal declaration of war, just days later on the 11th of December, was simply acknowledging what was, in his head, already the case. Actually, it was a lot deeper and a lot darker than just war with the Western powers and the USSR. Hitler was now utterly convinced that he was at war on a third, much nastier front. He was at war with the Jews as a people. This front was at least as important as the other two and consumed vast amounts of effort, resources and treasure in an attempt to exterminate an entire people. From the moment that German troops had crossed into Poland in 1939, the German state had begun killing, first its own people in the form of disabled children under a program called Aktion T4, and then the populations of the conquered territories. Special task forces, known as Einsatzgruppen, had followed German armies, murdering vast numbers of civilians, Jews first, but also anyone deemed undesirable in the glorious new Third Reich. Roma, homosexuals, intellectuals, politicians, lawyers, trade unionists, addicts, and many more were rounded up and shot or sealed into ghettos where they began to starve to death. However, in 1942, this new wider war brought the so-called final solution to the Jewish question, or the Holocaust as it's known today. The killings became industrialized, intensivized, and systematic. Victims were rounded up and deported en masse on cattle trucks to either be killed at specialist camps or worked to death. Millions died. And even as this was happening, the first joint US-UK operations began, firstly in North Africa in 1942, then in Sicily and Italy in 1943, but then, of course, most famously on D-Day in 1944. Over 70,000 US, 61,000 British and 21,000 Canadian troops went ashore on the 6th of June and began the work of liberating France and the Low Countries. They killed or captured some 400,000 German troops in 3 months of bitter fighting before taking Paris. By December of 1944, the combined British and American armies were on the border between Germany and France. The last great attack of the Nazis in World War II was destroyed at the Battle of the Bulge, and over that Christmas and New Year, the British and Allied forces began to advance into Germany proper. After this point, there was no hope for the Nazis. It took more than 5 months of fighting, but on the 30th of April 1945, Hitler shot himself rather than face capture by the Soviets, and on the 7th of May 1945, what was left of the Nazi High Command surrendered to the Allies at Eisenhower's Supreme Allied Headquarters at Reims in France. Meanwhile, in the Far East, the Japanese were no longer enjoying the kinds of victories that they'd won in the opening phases of the fighting. In June 1942, the US Navy won a major sea battle at a place called Midway, breaking the Japanese carrier forces, which in turn paved the way for a sequence of brilliant but horrifically bloody victories as they fought from island to island to get their bombers in range of the Japanese homelands. The Aussies had stopped the Japanese on land at New Guinea in September of 1942, inflicting the first major defeat on the Japanese army of the war to that point, and it was, after that, essentially all downhill for the Japanese. Over the next 3 years, they lost battle after battle on land and at sea and became more and more desperate, resulting in suicidal tactics which became normal in Japanese ranks. There had never really been any serious hope for Japan. She had launched a war that had killed upwards of 20 million people, despite senior commanders knowing full well that they couldn't win. By March, US bombers were in range of the home islands and unleashed a firebombing campaign which saw, in one night over Tokyo, over 83,000 people burnt to death. By the time of the Nazi collapse, the British had all but thrown the Japanese out of Burma. The Americans had won back most of the Philippines in a bloody battle which cost 300,000 Japanese and over 1 million Filipinos their lives, and the home islands themselves were being starved to death by merciless US submarine blockades. Still, the men in charge of the country refused to surrender, and the killing went on. Things came to a head in August. The first atomic bomb ever used was dropped on Hiroshima on the 6th, effectively wiping that city off the map and killing 140,000 people over the next 2 years. On the 8th, the Soviets finally declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, launching an offensive which shattered the Japanese army in China. And on the 9th of August, the US dropped a second atomic bomb, this time on the city of Nagasaki. It was too much. The emperor forced his generals to sue for peace, and the Second World War formally came to an end on the 2nd of September 1945. Something like 25 million military personnel and over 50 million civilians had been killed in the largest man-made loss of life in human history. Put another way, 24 hours a day for 2,193 days, someone was killed roughly every 2.5 seconds. It cast a shadow across the lives of all of those who'd lived through it. Indeed, it continues to shape our culture and our politics today. But if you ask me, it's worth remembering not for the big things, but for the small. The mother cradling her child to protect them from the horrors that big men in shiny suits had unleashed. The teenager in a foxhole thousands of miles from home, watching his mates get shot up because some silly tit thought that they were the master race. The parents who sent their children off to war never to see them again because some mad conspiracy theory had taken hold of their nation. So yes, of course, there's lots to learn about in the Second World War, the guns and the tanks and the planes and the ships, and it's all jolly cool and fun, but I do it to remember the dead and to make sure that we never have to do it again.